Have you ever wondered how an ordinary day could turn into a mystery? In Kentucky, John's calm farm life was shaken when his trusted mare, Midnight, started acting strangely. What was wrong with her? And what shocking discovery would change everything? Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, comment below where you're watching from. We'd love to hear. Now, let's dive into this incredible story. The Miller farm was a picture of serene beauty, tucked into the rolling hills of rural Kentucky. Generations of Millers had called this land home, cultivating its fertile soil and raising livestock with care. John Miller, now the last of his family line, had lived here his entire life. At 72, he moved with the measured pace of a man who understood the rhythm of the land. His sharp blue eyes, etched with the creases of age, still held a spark of energy as he went about his daily routine. John's mornings were a symphony of familiar sounds. The rhythmic hum of crickets, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the contented snorts of his horses in the barn. Midnight, his beloved black mare, was always the first to greet him. Her sleek, dark coat shone in the morning light, and her large, expressive eyes seemed to mirror the calm and steadiness John felt when he was near her. "She's the last one I'll ever train," John often said to the few neighbors who stopped by. And probably the best. Midnight had been a gift from his late wife, Eleanor, years ago. Now, she was more than a horse. She was a connection to a past filled with love and shared dreams. But on this particular morning, something was different. As John approached the barn with a bucket of oats, he noticed Midnight standing apart from the others. Instead of her usual calm demeanor, she was pacing restlessly near the stall door. Her hooves clattered against the wooden floor as she moved in tight circles, her tail flicking nervously. Her breathing was heavy, her nostrils flaring as though she were unsettled by something unseen. "Easy there, girl," John murmured, setting down the bucket and stepping closer. Midnight's ears twitched toward his voice, but she didn't calm. Her wide eyes darted toward him, then back to the door, as if trying to communicate something. John frowned and reached out to stroke her neck, only to find her coat damp with sweat. "What's gotten into you, girl?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Midnight had always been a steady, even-tempered horse. This kind of behavior was entirely out of character. The barn was quiet, save for Midnight's restless movements and the occasional whinny from the other horses. John scanned the space, searching for anything that might explain her agitation. Everything seemed as it should be. The stalls were clean, the feed bins were full, and the morning light streamed through the slats in the barn walls. Yet, something about the air felt off. As he stood there, Midnight let out a low, uneasy nicker and pawed at the ground. Her behavior tugged at the edges of John's mind, stirring a sense of unease he couldn't quite place. He stepped back, his boots crunching on the straw-covered floor, and gave her another once-over. "I'll figure it out, girl," he said softly, though a knot of worry had begun to form in his chest. He left the barn and walked toward the house, his hand automatically reaching for the phone on the kitchen wall. John's weathered fingers dialed a familiar number. The phone rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. "Dr. Carter's office. This is Rachel," the receptionist chirped. "Morning, Rachel. It's John Miller," he said. "Something's wrong with Midnight. Can you have the doc come out this morning?" Rachel hesitated. "He's on a call in town right now, but I'll let him know it's urgent." "Midnight, you said?" "That's right. She's acting strange, pacing, sweating. Something's not right." "Got it, Mr. Miller. I'll send him your way as soon as he's free." Hanging up, John stared out the kitchen window, his gaze fixed on the barn. The tranquil life he'd cultivated seemed momentarily shaken, replaced by an unfamiliar tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was unsettling Midnight was only the beginning. The sound of Midnight's restless movements echoed faintly through the barn as John paced his porch, waiting for Dr. Carter. A cool spring breeze swept across the rolling hills, carrying the scent of fresh grass and blooming wildflowers. Usually, this was the time of day John cherished the most, but his thoughts were clouded by worry. Dr. Carter's old green pickup truck rumbled up the gravel driveway just as the clock struck 10. The man behind the wheel was in his mid-40s, with a lean frame, sandy blonde hair, and a perpetual look of determination in his hazel eyes. Known for his calm demeanor and no-nonsense approach, Dr. Carter had become a trusted figure in the community, especially among the farmers who relied on him to keep their livestock healthy. John stepped off the porch, meeting him halfway. "Morning, Doc," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Thanks for coming out on such short notice." "No problem, John," Dr. Carter replied, grabbing his well-worn medical bag from the passenger seat. "What's going on with Midnight?" "She's not herself," John said, his tone heavy with concern. "Pacing the stall, sweating, acting like she's spooked by something. But there's nothing around to bother her." Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Let's take a look." The two men walked toward the barn, their boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, Midnight was still pacing, her movements jittery and erratic. The moment she saw John, she let out a soft nicker, her ears flicking forward as if pleading for help. "Hey there, girl," Dr. Carter said softly, approaching her with the practiced confidence of someone who had calmed hundreds of anxious animals. He set his bag down on a bale of hay and began his examination. As the vet ran his hands along Midnight's sleek, trembling body, John watched anxiously from the side. "She's never been like this, document. Not even during thunderstorms or when we had coyotes around." Dr. Carter listened closely as John spoke, his hands working with precision. He checked Midnight's pulse, inspected her gums, and examined her eyes. Finally, he stepped back, a puzzled expression on his face. "Well, her vitals are a little elevated, but that's expected with her being so worked up. Nothing else seems out of the ordinary, though," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then what's causing this?" John asked, his frustration seeping through. Dr. Carter shrugged. "Could be any number of things. Stress, a change in diet, even something she caught a whiff of outside." John frowned, the lines on his face deepening. "That doesn't sit right with me. Midnight's solid as they come. If she's this upset, there's gotta be a reason." Dr. Carter gave a slow nod. "I understand. Sometimes animals pick up on things we can't see or hear. I'll stay for a while and observe her." As the minutes stretched into an hour, Dr. Carter and John stood side by side, watching Midnight. The mare had stopped pacing but remained restless, her ears swiveling and her eyes darting toward the corners of the stall. Finally, Dr. Carter broke the silence. "You said she's been in this stall every night for the past few months?" "That's right," John confirmed. "Any chance she could have come into contact with another horse recently?" John shook his head. "Nope. Only horses around here are mine, and I haven't had visitors in weeks." Dr. Carter sighed, a furrow forming between his brows. "I'll run a few tests to rule out anything medical, but this kind of behavior, it's odd. If she doesn't settle down soon, give me a call." John nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Thanks, document." As Dr. Carter packed up his bag and headed back to his truck, John stayed behind, leaning against the stall door. Midnight turned her head toward him, her eyes filled with a quiet desperation that sent a chill down his spine. "Whatever's bothering you, girl," John murmured, stroking her mane, "we'll figure it out." But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something bigger was at play, something he couldn't yet understand. The sun dipped lower in the sky as John settled into his kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee. The barn, visible from the window, cast long shadows across the yard. Midnight's unease weighed heavily on his mind, and despite Dr. Carter's reassurance, John couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply wrong. He thought back to the times Midnight had been his steadfast partner, pulling him through long days of work and lonely evenings after Eleanor's passing. She wasn't just a horse to him. She was family. A sharp knock at the door broke his thoughts. John set his cup down and opened the door to find Dr. Carter standing there, his bag slung over his shoulder. "Evening, John," Dr. Carter greeted, his tone serious. "I've been thinking about Midnight." "Come on in," John said, stepping aside. He led the vet to the kitchen table, gesturing for him to sit. "You find something?" Dr. Carter nodded as he took a seat. "I ran some preliminary tests on the blood sample I took earlier. Nothing conclusive yet, but her hormone levels are elevated, enough to suggest something's going on. I wanted to discuss it with you in person." John frowned, his fingers drumming against the table. Hormones? Like what you'd see in a pregnant mare. It's possible, Dr. Carter admitted. But that doesn't make sense given what you told me about not having any stallions nearby. John's brow furrowed deeper. Not a single one. Document. I'd know if there was. Dr. Carter leaned forward, his voice lowering. Then we need to figure out how this happened. Horses don't just get pregnant out of the blue. Have you had anyone else working on the farm recently? Any visitors who might have brought another horse around? John's mind raced. He thought of the occasional deliveries and the neighbors who sometimes stopped by, but none of them had horses. Not that I can think of, he said, shaking his head. Wait, Emily. She's my neighbor's niece. Been helping out a bit to earn some extra cash. But she doesn't own a horse. Dr. Carter's expression turned thoughtful. Still, it might be worth asking her. Sometimes people don't think twice about things like leaving a gate open or letting another animal in. I'll talk to her, John said, determination hardening his voice. The next morning, John walked across the property to Emily's small house. The young woman was in her early 20s, with curly brown hair that always seemed to escape the loose braid she wore. She greeted him with a warm smile, wiping her hands on her jeans. Morning, Mr. Miller. Everything okay? She asked, noticing the stern set of his jaw. Emily, I need to ask you something, John said, his voice firm but not unkind. Have you ever seen anyone near the barn? Anyone who might have brought another horse onto the property? Emily's face fell, and her eyes darted to the ground. I didn't think it was a big deal, she stammered. A friend of mine needed a place to keep her horse for a night. I didn't think it would cause any problems. John's heart sank. When was this? About 2 months ago, Emily admitted, wringing her hands. She said it was just for one night. I didn't tell you because I thought it was harmless. John took a deep breath, steadying himself. Emily, midnight is acting strange. Dr. Carter thinks she might be pregnant. Do you understand what that means? Emily's eyes widened in shock. Oh, no. Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry. I didn't think. Sorry doesn't change what's done, John interrupted, his voice low and tight with frustration. You should have told me. Emily nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. I'll do whatever I can to make it right. John rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. For now, just stay away from the barn until I figure this out. Emily swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir. As John walked back to the house, he felt a mix of anger and sadness. Midnight's well-being was his priority, but the betrayal stung. He would have to tread carefully in the coming days, not just for the sake of his animals, but for the young woman who had clearly made a mistake. John spent the afternoon pacing the barn, his mind tangled in questions he couldn't answer. Midnight had calmed slightly, though her watchful eyes still followed his every move as if pleading for reassurance. He had always trusted his instincts, and they now screamed at him that this situation was far from ordinary. At dusk, Dr. Carter returned, this time with a portable ultrasound machine. He greeted John with a firm nod and set up his equipment in the barn. The gentle hum of the machine filled the air as he prepared to examine Midnight. This should give us some clarity, Dr. Carter said, his tone steady as he ran the probe across Midnight's abdomen. The mare stood still, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to her earlier agitation. John leaned against the stall door, arms crossed tightly over his chest. You're telling me there's a real chance she's pregnant? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Dr. Carter didn't look up. I've seen stranger things, John. Horses are resilient, but they don't hide pregnancies well. If she is, we'll know in a minute. The monitor flickered to life, and John's breath caught in his throat as an unmistakable shape appeared on the screen. There, Dr. Carter said, pointing to the image. That's a foal. John stared, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. How is this even possible? She hasn't been near a stallion. Dr. Carter sighed, leaning back. Well, now we know it happened, but not how. Foals don't appear out of thin air, John. That visitor Emily mentioned. It's our most likely explanation. A stallion must have been involved. John shook his head, a mix of anger and frustration building inside him. Why wouldn't she tell me? She knows better than to mess with my animals without asking. Dr. Carter placed a hand on John's shoulder. She's young, John. Probably didn't think it would lead to something like this. What matters now is making sure Midnight and the foal are healthy. John took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. What do we do next? The foal's small, Dr. Carter said, his tone cautious. That's not unusual, but we'll need to keep a close eye on them both. Midnight's older, and pregnancies at her age can be tricky. You'll need to make sure she's getting the right nutrition and isn't overexerting herself. John nodded slowly. I'll do whatever it takes. The two men worked late into the evening, setting up a separate area in the barn for Midnight. They laid down fresh straw and ensured she had easy access to water and feed. Midnight, as if sensing the care being taken for her, nickered softly and nudged John's shoulder. She's a good mare, Dr. Carter said with a small smile. She'll be a good mother. John stroked Midnight's mane, his expression softening. She's always been the best. Document. I just want to make sure she stays that way. As they finished up, Dr. Carter turned to John. One more thing. If you're still curious about the stallion, you might want to check your security cameras. They might give you some answers. John nodded, his jaw tightening. I'll do that first thing in the morning. That night, as the farm settled into its usual quiet, John sat alone in his living room. A single lamp cast a dim light over the room, illuminating the worn photographs of Eleanor and their younger days on the farm. He held a steaming mug of coffee, his mind swirling with thoughts of Midnight, the foal, and the implications of Emily's mistake. Before heading to bed, he looked out the window at the barn. Midnight's soft whinnies reached his ears, a reminder of the life growing inside her. Despite the frustration and confusion, a small spark of hope ignited within him. Shadow, as he had already begun to call the foal in his mind, might just be the beginning of something unexpected but beautiful. The dawn broke over the Kentucky hills, painting the farm in hues of orange and gold. John stood at the barn door, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon as he braced for the day ahead. The tension from the past few days still lingered, but there was also an undercurrent of anticipation. Midnight's foal was a mystery, one that was about to unfold. Inside the barn, Midnight paced her stall, her movements slower but still restless. John entered quietly, his boots crunching against the straw-covered floor. "Morning, girl," he murmured, stroking her sleek, black coat. Midnight leaned into his touch, a soft nicker escaping her lips. "You feeling all right today?" Just as John was about to leave the stall, he noticed something unusual. Midnight's breathing had become labored, her sides heaving with each breath. Her eyes, normally calm and steady, were wide and flickering with something that looked like urgency. "Midnight," John said, his voice tightening with concern. He stepped out of the stall and grabbed the phone hanging on the wall, dialing Dr. Carter's number with shaky hands. Dr. Carter arrived in less than half an hour, his green pickup skidding to a halt in the gravel driveway. He jumped out, medical bag in hand, and strode into the barn, where John was waiting with a worried expression. "She's starting, isn't she?" John asked, his voice laced with both fear and hope. Dr. Carter nodded. "Looks like it. Let's get to work." Inside the stall, Midnight was on the ground, her body trembling as she shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Carter knelt beside her, his hands moving with practiced ease as he assessed the situation. "She's doing fine so far," he said, glancing back at John. "But we need to be ready. This might take a while." The hours passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. John stayed by Midnight's side, stroking her mane and murmuring soothing words. His voice cracked as he whispered, "You're strong, girl. You've got this." Dr. Carter worked tirelessly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to John's barely concealed anxiety. Midnight groaned softly, her body straining as she pushed through the labor. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a tiny, trembling foal emerged into the world. Midnight let out a deep sigh, her body relaxing as the ordeal ended. Dr. Carter quickly cleaned the foal, his hands moving deftly as he assessed the newborn. "Well," Dr. Carter said, his face breaking into a smile, "you've got a healthy little colt here, John." John's breath hitched as he crouched down to get a closer look. The foal was small, his black coat glistening with the remnants of birth. His legs were long and gangly, barely able to support his fragile frame. Despite his obvious weakness, there was something striking about him. A small white star adorned his forehead, standing out against his dark coat. "He's beautiful," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter nodded. "He's a fighter, that's for sure. But he'll need extra care. Being this small, he's going to have a tougher time." John reached out, his rough hand brushing against the foal's damp coat. The tiny creature let out a soft, shaky whinny, and John's heart swelled with emotion. "Shadow," he said firmly. "That's his name." "Shadow." Midnight nudged the foal gently, her maternal instincts kicking in as she encouraged him to stand. Shadow wobbled on his spindly legs, his first attempts at standing both awkward and endearing. John couldn't help but chuckle softly, his earlier fears momentarily forgotten. Later that night, as Midnight and Shadow rested peacefully in their stall, John and Dr. Carter stood outside, leaning against the barn door. "You've got a special one there," Dr. Carter said, his tone warm. "Not just any mare could pull this off at her age." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the stall. "She's always been special. And now, with Shadow, I don't know. Document feels like there's some kind of purpose to all this." Dr. Carter clapped him on the shoulder. "Purpose or not, you've got your hands full. But if anyone can handle it, it's you." As the vet drove off into the night, John stayed by the barn, the quiet hum of the farm settling around him. He looked up at the sky, where the stars were just beginning to appear, and let out a long breath. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The morning light streamed into John's modest farmhouse, illuminating the small stack of handwritten notes on the kitchen table. He sipped his coffee slowly, the events of the previous day still fresh in his mind. Midnight's strength during the birth of Shadow had been nothing short of remarkable, but questions lingered in his mind. How had Midnight become pregnant? Who was responsible? John pushed his chair back with a sigh and headed to the barn. Shadow was already standing on his wobbly legs, nursing under Midnight's watchful eye. The foal's small, star-shaped marking on his forehead gleamed in the soft sunlight filtering through the slats in the barn walls. "You're a tough little guy, aren't you?" John said with a chuckle, resting his arms on the stall door. Shadow let out a tiny snort in response, and Midnight nickered softly. But John couldn't let the mystery go. He'd promised Dr. Carter he'd review the security footage from the barn, hoping it might shed light on the unknown stallion's appearance. With a final glance at Midnight and Shadow, he made his way to the small office next to the barn, where an aging computer sat beneath a layer of dust. John spent the better part of the morning poring over hours of footage, the grainy black and white images playing out on the screen. Most of it was uneventful. Midnight pacing in her stall, the occasional flicker of movement from mice scurrying along the edges of the barn, and the quiet stillness of the Kentucky nights. But then, as he fast-forwarded through a segment from 2 months ago, something caught his eye. A horse, unfamiliar and large, appeared in the barn. Its dark coat blended into the shadows, but its muscular build was unmistakable. The animal moved cautiously, its ears flicking nervously as it entered Midnight's stall. Moments later, a figure came into view. John froze the frame, his heart pounding in his chest. A man, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a thick jacket, stood near the stall. His face was obscured by shadows, but his actions were clear. He was leading the stallion to Midnight. "What the hell?" John muttered under his breath. He rewound the footage, studying the man's movements. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, lingering only long enough to accomplish his goal before slipping out of the barn with the stallion in tow. John clenched his fists, a wave of anger surging through him. Someone had trespassed on his property, violating the trust and safety of his farm. And now, because of that person, Midnight had endured an unexpected pregnancy, and Shadow's fragile existence was at stake. John's first thought was to confront Emily. She had admitted to allowing a horse onto the property, but she hadn't mentioned a man. Was she hiding something? Or was this an entirely different incident? He marched to Emily's small house, his boots kicking up dust with every determined step. Emily answered the door, her face pale as she saw his stern expression. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Is everything all right? Not exactly, John replied, his tone sharp. I reviewed the footage from the barn. There was a man. Someone brought a stallion into Midnight's stall. Care to explain? Emily's eyes widened in shock. A man? No, I didn't know about that. The horse I let in belonged to my friend Sarah. She never mentioned anyone else. John studied her face, searching for any hint of dishonesty. You're sure about that? Emily nodded fervently. I swear, Mr. Miller, if I had known someone else was involved, I would have told you. Her genuine distress softened John's anger, but the mystery only deepened. All right, he said, his voice gruff. If you hear anything at all, you tell me. Understand? Yes, sir, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. That evening, John sat on his porch, staring out at the darkening fields. The weight of the mystery pressed heavily on him. Somewhere out there was a man who had violated the sanctity of his farm and potentially jeopardized Midnight's health. But as he thought of Shadow, his resolve hardened. The foal was a miracle, despite the circumstances, and John would do whatever it took to ensure his safety and well-being. Whoever you are, he muttered to the empty fields, you've got a lot to answer for. The morning air was heavy with tension as John prepared for another conversation with Emily. The discovery on the security footage had only raised more questions, and he needed answers. Though her initial admission about the horse had seemed sincere, the presence of the unknown man changed everything. If Emily knew more, he had to find out. John made his way to her modest house, the gravel crunching under his boots as he walked with deliberate steps. Emily was outside, tending to a small patch of flowers near her porch. She glanced up as he approached, her face a mixture of guilt and apprehension. Morning, Mr. Miller, she said hesitantly, brushing her hands on her jeans. Did you find anything else? John stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. We need to talk, Emily. About that man I saw on the footage. Emily froze, her hands stilling mid-motion. Man? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, a man, John said, his tone firm but measured. He brought a stallion into my barn. Do you know who he is? Emily's face drained of color. She looked down, avoiding his gaze. I don't know, she stammered. I didn't know anyone else went into the barn. Emily, John said, his voice softening but still resolute. Look at me. If you know something, now's the time to come clean. She hesitated, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. Finally, she looked up, tears welling in her eyes. There was someone, she admitted, but I didn't think he'd do anything like this. John's jaw tightened. Who? His name's Ryan, Emily said, her voice trembling. He's a friend of Sarah's. He came with her that night to drop off the horse. I didn't think much of it. I just assumed he was helping her. Did he say or do anything suspicious? John pressed. Emily shook her head. No, he was polite, quiet, even. I never thought. Her voice broke, and she wiped at her eyes. I'm so sorry, Mr. Miller. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. John sighed, the anger in his chest giving way to a weary frustration. I believe you, Emily. But this Ryan, he's the one who brought the stallion to Midnight. He's the one responsible for Shadow. Emily's eyes widened. What are you going to do? I'm going to find him, John said firmly. And I'm going to make sure he knows exactly what he's done. That evening, John sat by the phone, a list of numbers scribbled on a notepad in front of him. He had asked Emily for Sarah's contact information, and after some hesitation, she had provided it. His hand hovered over the receiver before finally dialing the number. The line rang twice before a woman answered. Hello? Is this Sarah? John asked, his voice steady. Yes, who's this? This is John Miller. I own the farm where your horse stayed for a night a couple of months back. I need to ask you about the man who was with you that night. There was a pause on the other end. Ryan? Sarah said cautiously. Why? Did something happen? John gripped the phone tightly. Yes, something happened. He brought a stallion into my barn without my permission, and now my mare has a foal because of it. Another pause, longer this time. Oh my God, Sarah said, her voice filled with shock. I didn't know he did that. I swear, Mr. Miller, I didn't have any idea. Do you know where I can find him? John asked. He lives a few towns over, in Bardstown, Sarah said quickly. I can give you his address. John jotted down the information, his jaw set. Thank you, Sarah. And for what it's worth, I don't blame you. But this needs to be made right. I understand, she said softly. I'm so sorry. As the sun set, John leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the fields. Shadow was out there, a fragile life that had come into the world under unusual circumstances. The foal was innocent in all of this, but the man who had caused it needed to answer for his actions. John's resolve hardened. Tomorrow, he would head to Bardstown. It was time for Ryan to explain himself. The morning dawned cold and clear, a stark contrast to the tension building in John's chest. The drive to Bardstown, a small town nestled in Kentucky's horse country, gave him plenty of time to think. The rolling hills, lined with neat fences and dotted with grazing horses, usually brought him peace. Today, they only fueled his determination. The address Sarah had provided led him to a modest house on the outskirts of town. A rusty truck sat in the driveway, and the yard was cluttered with tools and equipment. John parked his truck on the roadside, taking a moment to gather himself. He had spent his entire life handling tough situations with calm resolve, but this was different. Midnight, Shadow, his farm, deserved justice. John climbed out of the truck and approached the front door. His boots thudded against the wooden porch, each step heavy with purpose. He knocked twice, the sound sharp in the quiet morning. The door opened slowly, revealing a man in his early 30s. He had a wiry build, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. Ryan's wary eyes met John's, and his body stiffened as if sensing trouble. Can I help you? Ryan asked, his voice cautious. You're Ryan, John said, his tone firm. Yeah. Who's asking? I'm John Miller. I own the farm where you and Sarah brought that stallion a couple of months ago. The one you snuck into my barn. Ryan's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Look, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, John interrupted, his voice rising slightly. I've got security footage of you bringing that horse into my barn. Now, my mare has a foal because of it. Ryan's jaw tightened, and he glanced away. I didn't mean for that to happen, he muttered. John stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You didn't mean for it to happen? Then why the hell did you do it? Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Sarah's horse needed a place to stay for the night. Midnight looked healthy, strong. I thought maybe she could, help. John's face flushed with anger. Help? You used my mare without my permission. Do you have any idea what kind of stress you put her through? She's older. This pregnancy could have killed her. I didn't think. No. John cut him off, his voice cold. You didn't think. You just acted. And now, I'm left cleaning up the mess. Ryan looked genuinely contrite, but John wasn't done. You owe me more than an apology. Midnight and her foal, Shadow, are going to need extra care because of this. You're going to make it right. What do you want me to do? Ryan asked, his shoulders slumping. For starters, you're going to cover the vet bills. Every last cent, John said. And you're going to explain yourself to Dr. Carter. Maybe he can drill some sense into you about the responsibility that comes with handling animals. Ryan nodded slowly, his voice subdued. All right, I'll do it. John stared at him for a long moment before stepping back. I don't want to see you anywhere near my farm again. If I do, you'll have a lot more than words to deal with. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Ryan said quietly. The drive back to the farm felt lighter, though John's mind remained unsettled. He had confronted Ryan, but the damage had already been done. Now, his focus was on ensuring Midnight and Shadow would thrive despite the circumstances. When he arrived home, Emily was waiting near the barn, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She straightened as John stepped out of the truck. How did it go? She asked. It's handled, John said gruffly. Ryan won't be causing any more trouble. Emily nodded, relief washing over her face. I'm so sorry, Mr. Miller. I never should have let them in. John sighed, his voice softening. You made a mistake, Emily. But what matters is how you make up for it. I want to help, Emily said earnestly. With Shadow, with Midnight, whatever you need. John regarded her for a moment before nodding. All right. You can start by helping me keep the barn in order. Midnight's going to need all the care we can give her. Emily's face lit up with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Miller. I promise I won't let you down. As the day wound down, John stood in the barn, watching Shadow as he wobbled on his unsteady legs. Midnight nuzzled the foal affectionately, her maternal instincts in full bloom. Despite everything, the sight brought a rare smile to John's face. You've got a tough road ahead, little guy, he said quietly. But you're not alone. For the first time since this ordeal began, John felt a flicker of hope. Shadow's arrival might not have been planned, but he was here, and he was part of the family now. The days following John's confrontation with Ryan brought a renewed sense of purpose to the farm. Shadow's delicate beginnings had given way to signs of growth and vitality, and Midnight, ever the devoted mother, seemed to thrive in her role. The foal's presence, though unexpected, had brought a unique energy to the quiet Kentucky farm. John poured his heart into caring for Shadow. His mornings began earlier, preparing special feed and ensuring the foal and Midnight had everything they needed. Emily, determined to redeem herself, arrived each day before sunrise, ready to help. Good morning, Mr. Miller. Emily greeted one crisp morning, a bucket of water in one hand and a pitchfork in the other. Morning, Emily, John replied, nodding toward her. Shadow's looking stronger, isn't he? Emily smiled as she watched the foal frolic awkwardly in the paddock. He's a miracle, Mr. Miller. Midnight's done an amazing job. She has, John agreed, his voice warm. But it's taken all of us working together. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, John had an idea. He stood by the fence, watching Shadow dart clumsily around the field, his little legs carrying him with a newfound confidence. Midnight trotted behind him, keeping a watchful eye. Emily, John called, his tone thoughtful. What do you think about hosting an event here on the farm? Something to celebrate Shadow. Emily turned, a puzzled look on her face. An event? Like a party? Not just a party, John said, stroking his chin. Something bigger. Invite the neighbors. Let the kids see the foal. Maybe raise awareness about how to care for animals properly. Emily's eyes lit up. That's a wonderful idea. Shadow's story could inspire people to be more responsible with their animals. John nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Exactly. And maybe it'll remind people that even unexpected situations can bring something good. Word of the event spread quickly through the small community. Neighbors who had known John for decades were eager to see the foal, and families with children were excited about a chance to visit the farm. Emily took charge of organizing the details, from arranging hayrides to setting up a small petting zoo for the kids. Dr. Carter even volunteered to give a short talk about animal care, using Shadow as a living example of resilience and the importance of responsible farming practices. The day of the event arrived, and the farm buzzed with activity. John watched from the porch as cars filled the gravel driveway and children ran excitedly toward the barn. Laughter and chatter filled the air, blending with the soft nickering of the horses. Shadow, now stronger and more confident, was the star of the show. He pranced around the paddock, his little legs no longer wobbly but full of energy. The children were enchanted, their giggles ringing out as Shadow approached the fence to investigate the tiny hands reaching toward him. Looks like he's loving the attention, Dr. Carter said, walking up to John with a smile. Not bad for a foal we weren't expecting, John replied, his eyes softening as he watched Shadow nuzzle a young girl's hand. You've done good by him, John, Dr. Carter said. By all of them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the fields, John stood before the gathered crowd. He cleared his throat, the noise quieting as people turned their attention to him. I just want to thank y'all for coming out today, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Shadow's story is one of unexpected beginnings. He wasn't planned, and his arrival wasn't easy, but he's taught me something important. Sometimes, the things we don't expect end up being the ones that bring us the most joy. The crowd applauded warmly, and John stepped back, his heart full as he watched Shadow trot toward Midnight. The mare lowered her head, nuzzling her foal gently, and John felt a deep sense of peace. That night, as the farm settled into its familiar quiet, John sat on the porch with Emily. The stars sparkled overhead, their brilliance undiminished by the passage of time. "You were right about today, Mr. Miller," Emily said, her voice soft. "It reminded people of what really matters." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the barn where Midnight and Shadow rested. "It reminded me too, Emily. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, but sometimes it surprises us in the best way." As the night deepened, John leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. Shadow's journey had begun with uncertainty, but it had brought renewal, not just to the farm, but to John's life as well. The weeks after the event marked a turning point for the Miller farm. Shadow continued to grow stronger, his once wobbly legs now carrying him confidently across the paddock. His playful spirit became a source of joy for John and Emily, and even the neighbors began referring to him as the miracle colt. John had always been a man of routine, but Shadow's arrival had brought an energy to the farm that he hadn't felt in years. The unexpected responsibility of raising the foal had given him a renewed sense of purpose, and with Emily's help, the farm was running more smoothly than ever. One crisp autumn morning, John stood at the fence, watching Shadow gallop alongside Midnight. The foal's shiny black coat glistened in the sunlight, the white star on his forehead standing out like a beacon. John rested his hands on the top rail, a contented smile tugging at his lips. "Morning, Mr. Miller," Emily called as she approached with a bucket of grain. "Shadow's looking more like a racehorse every day." John chuckled. "He's got spirit, that's for sure. Midnight's done a good job raising him." "And so have you," Emily said, setting the bucket down. She looked at him thoughtfully. "You've done more than just care for him, Mr. Miller. You've shown everyone what it means to take responsibility and make the best of unexpected challenges." John glanced at her, his expression softening. "I didn't do it alone. You've been a big help, Emily. More than I ever expected." She smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you. It means a lot." As the weeks turned into months, the farm became a hub of activity. Families who had attended the event continued to visit, bringing their children to see Shadow. Local farmers came to John for advice, inspired by his dedication and the story of Midnight and her foal. Even Dr. Carter mentioned how the story had spread, encouraging others to take better care of their animals. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, John sat on the porch with Emily and Dr. Carter. The air was cool, and the distant sounds of the horses settling for the night added to the peaceful atmosphere. "I never thought I'd be the center of attention around here," John admitted, sipping his coffee. "I've always preferred to keep to myself." Dr. Carter smiled. "Sometimes life has other plans. Shadow's story has brought people together. It's reminded everyone of the importance of care, compassion, and accountability." Emily nodded. "And it's given people hope. If something as unexpected as Shadow can bring so much good, it makes you wonder what else might be waiting just around the corner." John gazed out at the barn, his heart full. "Life doesn't always go the way we plan," he said quietly, "but maybe that's what makes it worth living. The surprises, the challenges, they're what keep us moving forward." That night, as the stars glittered overhead, John walked to the barn one last time before bed. Midnight and Shadow stood side by side in the paddock, their silhouettes dark against the soft glow of the moon. Shadow nuzzled his mother affectionately, and Midnight responded with a low, comforting nicker. John leaned against the fence, a sense of peace settling over him. Shadow had been an unplanned addition to his life, but he had brought renewal to the farm and a deeper understanding of what it meant to care, to endure, and to hope. "Good night, Shadow," John murmured, his voice low but warm. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, little guy." As he turned and walked back to the house, the quiet hum of the farm enveloped him, a reminder that life, even in its unpredictability, always had the potential for beauty. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and if you've watched until now, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to check out the next video appearing on the end screen. It's really exciting.